On a late-season afternoon, rain poured over the city like a sad, wordless song. Endless, cold, and without a chorus. The streets were flooded, headlights distorted into wavy streaks across the wet asphalt. People hurried by with heads down and eyes averted. No one stopped, no one noticed. We've all learned how to look away from too many things in life, but somewhere between the footsteps, next to a rust-stained electric pole, an old cardboard box lay askew, as if balancing between existence and oblivion. The rain had softened its edges, causing it to slump like a ragged piece of fabric, yet somehow it hadn't completely collapsed. Stranger still, it was breathing. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the rain. It was breath, rasping, faint, but unmistakably real. A sound too soft to be a cry for help, too fragile to turn ahead, but it clung to the air like a thread stretched across the breath of time. A man, just off his night shift at the factory, cycled down that street. His eyes were tired, his body weary, his mind focused only on the stale loaf of bread hanging from his handlebars. But he stopped. Maybe because of that sound. Maybe it was instinct, something dormant and forgotten. He parked his bike, pulled off a crumpled raincoat, and crouched down. The box collapsed further under his hand. As he gently peeled back the cardboard, a wave of mildew and wet fur hit him. Not foul, just alive. Inside were two soaked, trembling German shepherd puppies curled tightly together. The bigger one lay on top of the smaller, using its thin, fragile body to shield its sibling from the cold and wind, like a living blanket made of the last bit of warmth it had. That dog, Flint, lifted his head when the streetlight hit them. His eyes opened wide. There was no aggression, no howling, just stillness, deep as a windless lake. Those eyes didn't plead. They didn't fear. They spoke one thing and one thing only. Please, save him. There was no barking, no panicked reaction, only deliberate silence, as if Flint knew even one wrong sound might make someone turn away. Flint's body shuddered in waves, too exhausted to lift his head for more than a few seconds. Yet he kept one paw resting on his brother, Cove, as if it were the last act holding everything together. Cove was smaller, his breathing shallow and broken. Each time the rain lashed harder, his tiny body flinched as if trying to disappear into his brother. The man sat down right there on the ground. For a moment he didn't hear the rain anymore. Only the breathing. Only the eyes. Maybe he'd seen that same look before, in his wife's eyes as she lay dying, or in his daughter's when she first left home. That silent gaze, filled with trust and the readiness to give up everything to protect what mattered most. He took off his jacket and gently wrapped it around the two pups. Flint flinched as he was lifted but didn't resist. Even in the arms of a stranger, he held Cove tightly, his limbs curled around him, as if letting go would render survival meaningless. On the way to the vet, the man held the puppies close, pedaling through the flooded streets. The rain didn't stop. Behind him, the soaked cardboard box finally gave in, collapsing quietly, unnoticed. But before it dissolved, it had fulfilled its humble purpose, holding on to life just long enough for someone to stop. And now, that life was carried forward, by a gaze that couldn't speak, but knew how to love. Inside the emergency clinic at Fullbrook Animal Shelter, the rain had stopped, but the cold clung to every gray tile. Fluorescent lights shone down on two drenched bodies, curled tightly inside an old towel. A cold steel table now served as an emergency bed for two tiny beings caught between life and forgetting. Cove, the smaller one, wheezed for air, his chest rising and falling with difficulty. His frail frame revealed a slight arch of his spine, like a bow drained of all strength. His once silky coat was now matted, muddy, and tangled into clumps. The vet had to wipe him clean with warm water, slowly, because each touch made Cove tremble, as if that layer of filth was the last shield he had left against the world. Flint, The older, stronger, quieter brother was completely alert. He didn't resist. He didn't panic. Not a sound escaped him during the whole emergency procedure. But those who knew dogs could tell. This wasn't obedience. This was control. Flint knew exactly where he was. He knew what they were doing. And he was watching. Especially when they touched his brother. When the vet gave Cove a shot of antibiotics, Flint leaned in and gently rested his head on Cove's shoulder. Not interfering, not in the way, just sharing the pain. When the vet tested reflexes by pressing on Cove's legs, Flint turned his head away, eyes lowered. He couldn't help, but he would not leave. He wouldn't hand his brother over, not even to humans. By the next night, their body temperatures began to stabilize. The puppies were moved to Kennel 14, a small isolation unit, warm and quiet. Morin, the shelter's longtime caregiver, was the first to approach them. She cautiously opened the door, set down 2 small food trays, and stepped back to observe. Cove hesitated for a few seconds, then crawled forward to sniff, but before he could take a bite, Flint stepped in and gently nudged him back. Not to claim the food. Flint lowered his head and sniffed the tray thoroughly, checking the scent, the warmth. He pushed away the spoiled bits to the edge, tasted a little, and then nudged the tray back toward Cove. He didn't take another bite. Morin held her breath outside the kennel. She had never seen a puppy do this, especially not after abandonment, starvation, and cold. For most, food meant survival. But Flint didn't place himself in that order. He wasn't born to survive. He was born to keep someone else alive. By the 3rd day, Cove was moving more, his tail wagging softly at familiar faces. He could stand for a few seconds, pee on his own, and gave a faint bark when Morin entered. Flint, on the other hand, remained still. He let Cove approach, wag, draw attention, while he sat in the back, observing, assessing how each person interacted with his brother. Morin began to understand. Flint didn't fully trust humans. Not yet. He could endure them, but he wouldn't give his trust easily. Still, there was no aggression, no fear. Flint simply held on to something inside him. Something close to hope, but tested too many times. Sometimes, Morin would find Flint sitting in the corner of the kennel, back against the wall, eyes open, staring into the distance as if remembering a place long gone. Once, she dropped a metal spoon by accident. The clang of metal against tile echoed, and Flint jolted, froze, eyes wide. But he didn't growl, didn't bark. He just froze. A few seconds later, Cove walked over and nudged his head into Flint's neck, a soft, grounding gesture to pull him back. Flint sighed, shook his head gently, then nudged him back. No words, but clear. This was their language. One afternoon, Morin tried separating the two to clean the kennel. She locked Kennel 14 and moved Flint to the next one, and before she could even turn, a howl erupted behind her. Not long, not loud, but it silenced the entire shelter. Flint cried out, for the first time, his voice tearing open with fear, fury, pain, and desperation. Cove answered, barking wildly, pawing at the gate, screaming like he'd been left again. Morin dropped the broom and rushed to unlock the door. In a flash, Flint ran to his brother, pressing his head against him, sniffing every inch, as if missing a heartbeat would break him entirely. From that day on, no one talked about separating them again. Late at night, with the shelter quiet and only the hallway lights glowing faintly, Flint lay awake beside his sleeping brother. Wind slipped through the cracks, whistling like rain. He didn't flinch. He just opened his eyes and breathed slowly. No longer afraid, just guarded, like a creature who had learned early on that whatever survives loss is never whole again. Flint didn't know where he was, but he knew he still had his brother, and for that he would keep watch, not for hope, but for instinct, not to live, but to keep someone else alive. Some wounds don't show on the skin, they don't bleed, they leave no scars, but they linger in every reflex, every breath. And Flint, though still young, carried that kind of wound. The days that followed at Fullbrook Animal Shelter passed peacefully, at least for Cove. The younger pup was making a full recovery, barking louder, playing more, and slowly opening up to the staff. He often jumped against the kennel door when Morin arrived, flopping onto the floor, tail wagging wildly like a child who just discovered laughter. But Flint was different. He still watched over his brother, still moved with slow, precise responses to even the slightest change. He didn't bark. He didn't act out. And that was exactly what made Morin notice him more. One Saturday morning, the sun peeked out gently. The air around the shelter felt lighter than usual. A group of students arrived for a Volunteer with Animals Day. The children ran around the kennels, chirping with excitement, calling out to the dogs, whistling, clapping, and imitating barks for fun. Cove was thrilled, barking back every time someone mimicked him, tail wagging, jumping non-stop. But Flint froze. He didn't retreat to the corner like he was scared. He didn't hide. He stood still, front legs rigid, ears raised, eyes wide open but fixed on a single invisible spot in the air, as if something no one else could see had emerged from memory. Then a kid blew hard into a training whistle, shrill and piercing, over and over, and Flint changed. He sprang up with a sharp, guttural snarl, not loud, but sharp as a blade. His body tensed, shoulders stiff, eyes shifting from confusion to full alert. He growled again, this time a choked sound rising from his throat, not out of anger but pure panic, a desperate reflex to regain control. Morin rushed in immediately, asking the kids to stop, and escorted Flint out of the main kennel area. But one glance at his eyes told her everything. Flint had just walked into an old room of memories no one else had the key to. That evening, Morin stayed after hours. Most lights were off, and the hallways were quiet. In the soft glow of the admin office, she opened Flint's digital records, for the first time, deciding to trace his past. A quiet note appeared. Original name: Maximus, German Shepherd, purebred source, Ridgeway County K9 Training Center. Status: returned after 5 weeks of training. Reason for discharge: unstable under pressure. Displays excessive emotional attachment to non-training subject. Unsuitable for high-risk operations. Special notes: when given the attack command, the dog did not respond if the subject was near a small yellow puppy it had been housed with from the start. Prioritized protecting that second subject over the handler. Final assessment: overly emotional. Does not meet operational standards. Morin exhaled slowly. She printed the note, folded it with care, and placed it on her desk. In the hallway light, she walked back to Kennel 14. Flint wasn't asleep. He was curled tightly next to his brother, eyes open. Not empty anymore, but storm-worn. She sat silently in front of the kennel. After a long pause, Flint raised his head and looked at her. Then he stepped closer, resting his head near the bars. Not touching, just close enough. She didn't reach out. She just said softly, "You were chosen once, weren't you? But you chose your brother." Flint didn't answer. He was a dog. But in those eyes, she saw something close to recognition. As if he'd once stood in front of a line of uniforms, responded to commands, tried his best to do right, and failed. Not because he was weak, but because he stayed loyal to something not written in the manual: love. From that day on, Morin banned all whistles in the kennels. She told the staff, "We're not just caring for dogs. We're safeguarding memories no one bothers to understand." And Flint? He no longer reacted to calls or commands. But every morning, when Morin touched the kennel door and said, "Good morning," he would lift his head, come closer, and gently lick her hand. Just once, then return to his brother. Not for food, not to please, but in response to the only thing he was never trained for but always understood: kindness when no one was watching. Since that night when Morin quietly printed out the record, her gaze toward Flint changed. It wasn't just empathy from an animal lover anymore. It was respect for a soul that had once chosen loyalty over glory. A dog who once stood before a system's expectations but chose to step back, into the shadows with his brother, where there was no applause or rewards, only silent devotion. Flint didn't need anyone to know what he used to be. He just needed to be here. With him. And Cove, brighter by the day, like sunshine after a long storm. He dashed around the kennel, tail wagging endlessly whenever Morin approached. Some days, he barked as if calling her in to play, then flopped onto the ground, rolling like a living teddy bear. Once, when Morin leaned down, Cove licked her cheek, wet, awkward, but full of trust. Flint, as always, kept to the back. He didn't intrude. He watched, but every time Morin walked away, Flint was the one who stepped forward, resting his head against the kennel bars, watching her until she disappeared around the corner. At first, the staff thought it was odd. They'd never seen two dogs so inseparable, not even for a few minutes. But Morin understood. This wasn't just sibling affection. Between Flint and Cove was something deeper, a silent vow that if they'd been separated once, it would never happen again. But that very bond soon became a problem. Monday morning, during the weekly meeting, Director Larson flipped open their file and spoke in his usual dry tone. Kennel 14. 2 shepherd pups. No adoption interest. Their holding period is nearing the limit for non-emergency cases. If no one adopts both within 10 days, we'll have to split them to increase single adoption chances. We can't hold a pair just for attachment. Morin set her teacup down, hand slightly trembling. She looked at Larson. Not angry, just calm and cold. You're calling that kind of attachment just? So if 2 orphan children had no takers, we'd separate them because it increases survival odds, is that it? Larson frowned. We're not a social service, Morin. We're a transition facility. The longer they stay, the fewer spots we have for others needing help. I don't need emotional arguments. I need solutions. That night, Morin returned to Kennel 14. She brought nothing. No food, no chart, no clipboard. Just herself. She sat down, leaned against the opposite wall, and looked through the bars. Cove was asleep, head resting on his brother's leg, breathing steady like a child in peace. Flint, of course, was awake. Not because he worried, but because he was used to guarding someone else's sleep. Morin whispered, They said you're too emotional. Not suitable. But maybe it's exactly because you are emotional that you're the most suitable of all. Maybe this world needs more hearts that choose connection over compliance. Flint didn't move, but he came closer. No licking. No leaning. Just sat near the bars, close enough for Morin to see his eyes in the dim light. And she saw it. Those weren't just the eyes of a dog. They were the eyes of a soul once chosen, then discarded, because it dared to love. The next morning she placed a small sign on Kennel 14, bonded pair, Flint and Cove, must be adopted together. The younger staff shook their heads. They knew this would slow down the adoption process. But Morin wouldn't budge. She walked slowly past the kennels, gazing into each pair of eyes behind the bars, eyes of creatures learning how to wait, even though no one had taught them how. Flint, as usual, lifted his head when she passed. She stopped, leaned down, and said softly, Not a plea, not a comfort, but a promise. If there's someone out there worthy of loving both of you, they'll come. You just have to wait a little longer. I won't let anyone separate what's been stitched together in blood. And Flint, in his quiet way, nodded. So slightly only someone truly paying attention would notice. In a world obsessed with what's easier and faster, people forget that some bonds take time to form, and trust to protect. Flint didn't dream of a mansion, nor wished for grand things. He only needed a small place where the two of them could sleep side by side each night, without the fear of waking up alone again. And sometimes, that small thing is the hardest thing to hold on to. Some promises don't need to be written down. If once spoken from the heart, they'll always find a way to be kept. Morin wasn't sure if Flint had fully understood the words she'd whispered that night. But from the very next morning, every time she approached, Flint would step up to the front of the kennel and sit. Not for food, not for anything in return. Just to wait, like someone who had chosen to believe, and was now learning how to be patient with that belief. On the 5th day after the "only adopt as a pair" sign went up, Mrs. Della appeared. She was an older woman, slender yet composed, a pale ivory scarf tied neatly at her neck despite the warmer weather. Her silver hair was pinned in place. Her shoes were tidy, her posture careful, like everything about her had long been arranged, from the courtesy in her eyes to the gentleness in her voice. Mrs. Della said she was just dropping by to have a look, but her gaze wasn't one of casual curiosity. It was the look of someone trying to fill a space, not with objects, but with life. Some part of her soul had broken off, and she still clung to the habit of searching for it in the eyes of small, living creatures. Morin walked her past the kennels. The puppies wagged, barked, and jostled for attention. But Mrs. Della didn't linger. She smiled politely and nodded here and there. Only when she reached Kennel 14 did she stop. Cove, true to form, had heard the footsteps from afar. He ran to the front, tail wagging furiously, bouncing up and down, but he didn't bark. He didn't clamor. He simply looked at the stranger with wide, eager eyes, as if recognizing her from some life before this one. Mrs. Della stood still, her hand tightened around her bag strap, her eyes flickering with surprise, then softening. "He has the same eyes as my grandson," she said quietly, her voice trembling, as though drifting out from a memory that didn't want to be named. Morin didn't ask. But Mrs. Della spoke anyway. Not a full story, just fragments. That she once had a gentle grandson who loved dogs. He died in a bicycle accident at age 11. Since then, she hadn't kept another animal. Not because she didn't love them, but because she was afraid. Afraid that anything capable of love might leave her again. "But today," she said, eyes still on Cove, who was now trying to reach his paw through the bars to touch her dress, "I feel like something called me back." Flint, in the background, remained still. No growling, no approach, just watching, with an expression that held no resentment, no resistance, but an ache so quiet it almost silenced the room. Cove glanced at his brother, as if seeking permission to keep playing with the stranger. Flint slowly nodded. Just once, and Cove continued, happily. "What's his name?" Mrs. Della asked. "Cove," Morin replied, "and that's Flint, his brother." "Brother?" she echoed, pausing. Morin nodded. "They haven't been apart for even a second since the day they were found." "Oh," Mrs. Della murmured. "I don't think I can take both. My house is small, and I still have to tend to my bad leg. But I could take Cove, if that's allowed." Her words dropped into the quiet hallway like a gentle knock at the heart's door. Morin stayed silent for a moment, then shook her head gently. "I'm very sorry, Mrs. Della, but the shelter's policy, and my own choice, is that they can only be adopted together." Mrs. Della hesitated. There was a flicker of conflict in her eyes, but she didn't turn away. "I truly can only care for one dog. I don't want to take him only to return him later." Morin looked at Flint, still upright, still silent in his post. She spoke softly. Flint was once trained as a K9 dog. He was dismissed for being too emotionally attached. He's not your typical dog, Mrs. Della. He doesn't run up to win affection. But he understands everything. And he's already lost his brother once. I don't know if he can survive losing him again." Mrs. Della said nothing for a long time. She sat on a nearby bench, hands clasped, eyes down. The distant barks of puppies echoed through the shelter. But in this part of the kennel, the air held still. Cove lay down, resting his head on his paws, never looking away from the woman. Finally, Mrs. Della stood, stepped closer to the kennel, and gently placed her hand against the bars. "My grandson had a dog, too. It only lived for 3 years, but it never left his bed whenever he had a fever. Maybe I do understand." She said no more, simply bowed slightly to Morin and left quietly. That day, Flint didn't come to the front of the kennel when Morin returned. He lay beside Cove, head resting on his brother's back, eyes half closed. He didn't need to hear what happened. Flint didn't live by sound. He lived by feel, and he had just felt something pass very close, but not close enough to stay. The next morning, Fallbrook Animal Shelter was soaked in a pale, damp light, the kind that lingers before a storm. No one said much. The kennel hallway felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen that no one wanted to name. Morin arrived earlier than usual. She made a cup of tea, but left it untouched on her desk. As she walked into Wing A, where Kennel 14 was, her steps slowed. From afar, she saw Flint curled next to Cove, both dogs seemingly asleep, just like every other day. But she knew that sleep wasn't whole. Flint's ears were still perked, his breathing steady but shallow. He hadn't truly slept since the day Mrs. Della visited. At 10 a.m., Mrs. Della returned. Her scarf today was darker and heavier, and her hands trembled slightly as she handed over the adoption papers. Her face was calm, but her eyes still carried hesitation, as if each step was a negotiation between logic and something softer in her heart. "I haven't changed my mind," she said quietly. "I can only take Cove, but if someday I'm healthier, more settled, I'll come back." Morin didn't respond. She quietly led her to the kennels and signaled for another staff member to open the gate. Cove, thrilled as always, recognized her instantly. He ran out, jumped, and licked her hand. No one had taught him, but Cove had chosen her, the way a child chooses someone who feels safe. The kennel door swung open. A leash was looped gently around Cove's neck. Flint still hadn't moved. He sat upright, head held high, eyes wide open, but his legs trembled, barely noticeable unless you stood close. He didn't howl. He didn't growl. He didn't block the way. He simply watched, as if asking one last time, "Will someone come back this time?" Cove looked back at his brother. His eyes didn't understand, but they sensed something was off. Still, he let himself be led away. No one had told him not to. And Flint, as always, made no sound. He simply swallowed it all down. As Cove stepped across the threshold, Flint leaned forward slightly, just a twitch, as if instinct urged him to move. But he stopped. Not from fear, but from knowing. If he cried out now, the door might close faster. Morin stood by, gripping the file in her hands. Her heart twisted, but she said nothing. She knew, at that moment, no words would be right. No action wouldn't feel like interference. Cove turned one last time as he walked down the hall. He stretched his neck, trying to peer through the kennels, and barked once, not loud, not strong, just a sound thin as mist. Inside, Flint finally closed his eyes, but he couldn't stop the tears. That afternoon, the rain returned. Not a downpour, but a steady drizzle, enough to coat the shelter windows in round droplets, each rolling slowly, like farewells that hadn't been properly said. Flint lay in the corner of the kennel, where he and Cove used to sleep together. He didn't touch his lunch, didn't go near his favorite chew toy. Every sound in the hallway made his ears twitch, but his eyes no longer looked toward the door. Morin sat in her office, her hand resting on the phone. She had wanted to call. But she knew. Mrs. Della wasn't wrong. She just didn't know. Just like this world, it's not always cruel, just full of people who choose just enough kindness to stay safe, never enough to hold something completely for someone else. That night, Morin stayed late. When she passed Kennel 14, Flint didn't stir, but when she paused long enough, he raised his head. No resentment, no anger, just the eyes of someone who always knew this day would come, and was now trying to learn how to survive it again. Morin couldn't step inside, not because of the rules, but because if she touched that dog's head, her own heart might break. Instead, she just whispered, her voice trembling like the rain falling just beyond the roof. "I'm sorry, but if there's even the smallest bit of hope, we'll go find it, okay?" Flint looked at her for a long time, then turned away, rested his head on the worn blanket, and let out a long breath, not from exhaustion, but because, for the first time in days, Flint had to teach himself how to sleep alone. Every afternoon after Cove left, The hallway of Kennel Block C fell into a strange quiet. No more excited barking from the two pups once housed in Kennel 14. No more eager scratching at the tile floor when Morin approached. Only a strangled silence, like a song cut off mid-chorus before it could reach its peak. Flint didn't howl, didn't call, didn't cause a fuss. He wasn't like any dog Morin had seen separated from a bonded partner. He didn't lose control, didn't destroy anything, didn't beg. But it was the absence of reaction. The way Flint rested his chin on an old toy, staring blankly into the hallway, that revealed something was collapsing quietly inside him. He didn't eat. Not because he wasn't hungry, but because he couldn't find a reason to. Each morning his bowl was placed neatly inside the kennel, half dry, half wet, with a few pieces of chicken he used to love. But he never touched it. He didn't even look. Instead, around 4 p.m., the exact time Cove used to be taken outside, Flint would get up, carry the ragged stuffed bear they had shared since their earliest days at the shelter, and place it by the front of the kennel. The bear was missing an ear, its fur matted from saliva and dust, but Flint handled it like something sacred. He'd set it down facing the hallway, then lie next to it, chin on his paws, eyes wide open, watching. No one came. On the first day, he kept his eyes open for nearly an hour. Every passing footstep made him flinch. Every distant bark made him lift his head. But when no one stopped at his kennel, and no one came from the hallway leading to the exit, Flint would sink lower into the ground, like someone slowly fading into a silent disappointment too deep for words. The second day, he came out at the same time. But this time, he didn't lift his head. He just lay still, their eyes open. Not to search, but because he couldn't close them anymore. Morin began documenting every detail. Flint continues to refuse food, maintains fixed waiting posture at the same hour daily, no response to name, no initiative, no reaction to favorite foods, clear signs of depressive behavior, warning, immune response weakening rapidly. That evening, Morin sat by the kennel longer than usual. The rain had just started. Soft, relentless, seeping through the wind cracks with a cold that clung to the skin. Flint didn't come to greet her. He stayed where he was, chin on the stuffed bear. But his eyes no longer looked outward. They'd grown blank as if the only thing still moving in his mind was time. And time no longer mattered if no one ever came back. Morin whispered through the bars, her fingers curling gently around the cold steel. Flint, you know some creatures lose what they love and fight to find it again, but some choose to wait because they believe that where they wait is where love will return. Flint didn't move, but his tail quivered, not wagging. A spasm, like someone trying to swallow the emotion crawling up their spine. The next morning, Garrett, the vet, came by for a checkup. He crouched in front of the kennel, watched Flint for a long time, then said quietly to Morin, "He's not going to eat. But if we don't get fluids or supplements into him soon, he'll start fading." Morin shook her head. "I know, but I don't want to force anything on him. Flint isn't a pet. He's like someone who's lost his compass. If we push, he might think there's nothing left he's allowed to choose for himself." Garrett nodded, solemnly. On the fourth afternoon, Flint still brought out the stuffed bear, right on time. But this time he didn't lie beside it. He left it at the front, then retreated toward the back of the kennel, as if he no longer had the strength to witness one more "no one came." Morin watched this from a distance, her chest tightening. Every movement meant something. Flint hadn't given up hope, but he was beginning to believe that hope wasn't meant for him, and that was more dangerous than despair. That night, Morin picked up a fountain pen and wrote a letter, the first handwritten one in over 10 years. Her handwriting trembled. "Dear Mrs. Della, I don't know if you remember me. The older woman who cared for Kennel 14, where you once met Cove. I'm not writing to persuade you to change your mind. I only want to tell you about Flint. He doesn't lash out. He doesn't cry. He hasn't shown any negative behavior. But every day, at the exact hour Cove used to be taken out, Flint carries a worn toy to the front of the kennel and lies beside it. He does not eat. He does not seek contact. He does not rebel. He waits. Not everyone is sensitive enough to know this, but sometimes silence is the most painful form of grief. I dare not ask you for anything, but if even a flicker of memory remains in your heart from the way Cove nuzzled your hand that first day, please reconsider. Sometimes love doesn't need to choose the most practical option. It only needs to choose the one that's waiting. Sincerely, Morin. She folded it and placed it in an envelope, but didn't seal it. Just left it on the desk, like an unsent invitation in which she had already left part of her heart. Meanwhile, Flint still brought out the bear every afternoon. Even though his eyes had dimmed, his ears didn't perk anymore, his body still carried out the ritual, like a gatekeeper who had never been told he could leave his post. Not because he believed someone would come, but because he no longer knew what else to do. That morning, the sky hung low. Pale light filtered through the tree canopy outside, casting a blurry film across the shelter's hallway window. Moran arrived earlier than usual, cradling her clipboard and notes, weighed down by the knowledge that Flint still hadn't eaten, still brought out the same torn, stuffed bear, still laid in that same wordless wait, not guarding a toy, but the last fragile idea of what once felt like life. The sound of boots echoed through the hallway, sharp, rhythmic like steel tapping old memory. The man who appeared at the entrance to Wing A looked nothing like anyone who'd ever come searching for a companion. He radiated control and cold. A heavy gray leather coat hung from his broad frame, and his eyes sliced through the air like a worn blade, sharp, dry, and too detached to be warm. Cliff Monroe. A name Morin had only heard in passing, now standing in flesh and bone. He had once trained war dogs for private military units, and now he said he was looking for a strong candidate, not necessarily obedient, just one that'll respond to command when it matters. He walked down the kennels like someone shopping for a weapon, not meeting a soul. No kneeling, no soft words, no gestures of care. And then, at Kennel 14, he stopped. Flint was still lying down, head on the one-eared bear. He wasn't staring at the door anymore. He stared at the floor, eyes not hoping, but holding himself from falling apart. And yet, it was that very look that caught Cliff's interest. He smirked, then nodded slightly. "This one has fire," he said in a raspy voice, like someone who had spent a lifetime in echo chambers where only obedience mattered. Morin looked up from her desk the moment she heard him pause. She moved quickly, clipboard still in hand. The way Cliff was looking at Flint made her cold inside. It wasn't the look of someone seeking companionship. It was the look of someone identifying an opportunity. "I want this one," Cliff said to the adoption clerk, his tone closer to command than request. "This one has potential. I've seen that look before. Broken spirit, but still burning. Train him right, and he'll be a weapon." Morin froze. A cold fury crawled up her spine. But when she spoke, her voice was composed, sharp as ice. "Mr. Monroe, Flint is not a tool, not a war dog. He's a living being holding on to the last of himself after losing what mattered most. What he needs is healing, not to be pushed deeper into the abyss." Cliff shrugged, face blank. "I know pain. I know how to rebuild instinct from it. It's pain that revives their edge." Morin stepped forward, placing herself between him and the kennel door. "You're wrong. Not every wound needs to be cut deeper to heal. Flint doesn't need restructuring. He needs someone who accepts him as he is, without demanding he become anything else." Cliff narrowed his eyes, and then, from within the kennel, a growl cut through the air. Not loud, not long, but sharp, defiant. Flint had risen, not to attack, but to retreat. Slowly, he backed into the far corner, ears flat, back hunched, legs trembling. His eyes weren't angry. They were terrified, like a child seeing the shadow of the person who once dragged them into the dark. Morin dropped to her knees beside the bars, voice trembling. "It's okay, Flint. I'm here." But Flint didn't look at her. His gaze was locked on the man, every muscle tensed, expecting a blow, a cage, something taken. He didn't know what would happen, but he knew this. If he didn't resist now, something inside him would be lost forever. "Enough," Morin said, rising and turning towards Larson, the shelter director who had just stepped out, alerted by the noise. "If you approve this adoption," she said, her voice clear and final, "I'll resign today, and I'll report this to the Animal Welfare Council. No ethical clause permits us to hand over a wounded soul to someone who sees pain as a tool." Larson hesitated. Cliff scoffed, rolled his eyes, and shrugged dismissively. "Pain makes dogs obedient. If he doesn't want to live, I'll teach him how to survive. But fine, if this place only shelters weak pets, I'm out." And he left. His boots struck the tile with a metallic thud, each step like a nail driven into the path Flint had barely survived walking. Once the man was gone, Morin opened the kennel and stepped inside. She sat beside Flint. He was still curled in the corner, freezing. The stuffed bear lay limp beside him, like a forgotten witness. "No one's going to train you through pain ever again," she whispered, placing a hand on his shoulder. "No one gets to turn your loss into their weapon." Flint slowly lifted his head. His eyes softened. And then, like a child who just needed a place to lean, he pressed his body gently into her knee, silent. That night, Morin updated his file. No single adoptions allowed. No training use transfers. Only accept applications from families committed to caring for both dogs with love and long-term stability. Garrett read it quietly, then asked, "What if no one ever adopts them, Morin?" She didn't turn around. Her eyes rested on an old photo. Two pups curled beside each other, one jet black, the other pale gold. "Then I will," she said softly. That night Flint slept again in his kennel. He'd eaten a little, just a few bites, but it was a start. The stuffed bear had been returned to its usual place, and for the first time in many nights, Flint slept deeply, not because he had stopped waiting, but because now he knew. Here, no one would ever try to steal anything from his pain again. The next morning, when Morin arrived at the shelter with eyes still puffy from a restless night, she didn't hope for anything grand. Just to see Flint eat a few bites, or rest his head on his old toy with less tension in his eyes. That would have been a good day. But that day, fate, which had been harsh in Flint's early chapters, quietly cracked open a door. Warmth didn't arrive through a call, but through the silent presence of a man who said nothing. He arrived at 9 a.m., just when the sun was soft enough not to burn, and the wind light enough not to unsettle sensitive souls. He came with a young girl, around 12, her hair tied back hastily, arms wrapped around a dog-eared book. They didn't look like people coming to adopt. No noise, no scrutiny, no rushing from kennel to kennel. They walked slowly down the hallway, their eyes full of quiet respect, like they were passing through a silent library of lives not yet fully read. Morin stepped out of the office and nodded a greeting. He replied with a slight nod, wordless. The girl introduced herself in a soft, clear voice as Ileana, and said the man was her grandfather, Mr. Ellis, a retired teacher who had lived alone since his wife passed away, keeping a small garden in the suburbs. "Grandpa doesn't talk much," Ileana said, her eyes slightly lowered. "But I think he needs a friend. Not to fill a void, but to hold on to what's left." Morin didn't respond right away. She just smiled gently and gestured for them to follow, then silently guided them down the row of kennels. The dogs, as always, barked excitedly, tails wagging, competing for attention. But Mr. Ellis didn't stop at any kennel. He just walked, eyes steady, not searching, not avoiding. Then he stopped in front of Kennel 14. Flint was lying in his usual spot, head resting on the old stuffed bear. But unlike every other day, he didn't retreat at the sight of strangers. He didn't growl, didn't look away. He raised his head slowly and looked at Mr. Ellis, not with suspicion, but as if listening. No one said a word. Ileana stood behind, holding her breath. Morin watched, her heartbeat soft but insistent, like waiting for an answer in a language without sound. And then Flint stood. No hesitation. No tension. He walked toward the front of the kennel and gently set down the toy bear by the bars. No barking. No signals. He simply sat, quietly, just inside the gate, at Mr. Ellis's feet, as if he had known him for a long, long time. Mr. Ellis bowed his head, not smiling, not reaching out. He simply sat down, the faint reflection in his glasses meeting Flint's eyes. Two beings aged differently, but equally silent, as if their stillness was a story already begun long ago. Morin felt a pinch at the corner of her eye. Not from some loud emotion, but from knowing that Flint didn't open up easily, and the way he sat like that, not fearful, not guarded, was a fragile, vital sign. Ileana stepped beside her grandfather and whispered, "Does he remind you of Nana?" Mr. Ellis didn't answer, but he placed his hand slowly on his knee, where Flint's gaze rested. And in that small act, Morin understood. It was a response, not in words, but in the part of his heart that had just been gently filled. Flint leaned forward slightly, letting his nose brush the man's hand. Not lingering, not needy, just a single touch, the first imprint of a bond that needed no explaining. After the meeting, Mr. Ellis didn't fill out adoption papers. He simply asked Morin, in a voice rough from disuse, "Is he waiting for someone?" Morin looked toward the kennel, where Flint had returned to lie beside his bear, but hadn't retreated deep into the corner as he used to. "Yes," she replied. "Someone who took his brother. And we don't know if they'll return." He nodded, still gazing at the dog, now dozing near the bars. "I'm not in a hurry," he said. "If he needs time, I've got a lifetime to wait." That night, Morin added a line to Flint's file. A man who said nothing, but Flint approached. And for the first time in many nights, Flint slept without holding his bear. He curled up neatly, head resting on his paws, like a child who knows that tomorrow someone might come, not to take him away, but to stay. After that fateful morning, Mr. Ellis began visiting the shelter regularly, not at fixed times, never announced, and never once did he ask about adoption procedures. He simply came to Kennel 14, sat by the bars, or, when allowed, entered the private visiting room, a space warmed by gentle light, furnished with a well-worn fabric armchair and an old rug once used during early recovery cases. Flint didn't show excitement when Mr. Ellis arrived, but he didn't need time to remember either. He recognized the man the moment his footsteps echoed down the hall. No barking, no tail wagging. Just rising to his feet, leaving the toy bear where it was, and walking softly to the gate, as if the man's presence was a natural thing. Not a surprise, not something to question. That afternoon, the shelter was quiet. Morin reserved the visiting room just for them. Soft light filtered through the curtains, casting gentle stripes across the pale tiles. Mr. Ellis sat in the old armchair, hands folded, as though about to open a drawer of memory long left untouched. Flint didn't wait for a command. He walked over slowly and lay down by the man's feet, his body pressing lightly against the chair. He didn't rest his head on Ellis's lap. No clinging, no begging. He simply lay there, close, as if in that silence he'd found a breath steady enough to finally rest beside. Mr. Ellis didn't pet him, didn't stroke him. He just sat, looking toward the sunlit window, and spoke in a voice dry and wooden, like aged timber. "She always believed dogs could heal," he said. "Not with magic, but with their silence. Dogs don't ask, don't make you retell every loss. They just lie beside you as if to say, 'Whenever you're ready, I'm here.'" Flint didn't move, but his ears flicked slightly, not from sound, but from that voice, a voice telling a story not to be heard, but to be understood. "I lost her 2 winters ago," he continued. "It hurts in that place where I can still hear her calling from the garden, calling like I was the only one worth turning back for. After she passed, I stopped planting, stopped playing the radio, but I kept the chair she used to read in. Never placed anything on it." Sunlight touched half of his face, revealing all the creases time had written, and in that moment, Flint lifted his head. Not high, just enough to meet the man's eyes. The dog looked at him, unblinking, unwavering, a gaze straight and soft. Not probing, not pitying, just listening, with his whole body. And when Mr. Ellis lowered his calloused hand to Flint's back, the dog didn't retreat. He leaned in a little more. A small gesture, but the clearest answer any lonely soul could hope for. A while later, Mr. Ellis exhaled. Not heavily, but like the dust had been gently brushed off a long, unopened part of his heart. "Strange," he murmured, not to anyone in particular. "He didn't need me to call him, didn't ask me to promise anything. He just came and stayed, as if he were choosing me, not the other way around." Morin, behind the half-closed door, heard it all. She didn't enter, didn't jot notes. She simply held the doorframe, her palm trembling once, because she understood what Flint had just done wasn't just opening up. It was the rare act of granting trust. That night, Morin sat alone in the office. She opened Flint's file and paused at the section marked Current Status. Beneath the line that read, "In recovery," she added in blue ink, "Has begun sitting with memory, no longer running from it." Then she smiled, for the first time in many days, because she knew that some creatures don't need to be rescued. They just need a place quiet enough to sit down and let the weight fall away. And Flint had begun to sit. Ever since that quiet meeting in the visitation room, Ileana, the girl with the haphazard ponytail and calm gaze, began visiting the shelter more often. She no longer walked in beside her grandfather, but came alone, stepping into the kennel hallway as though this place had become an extension of a classroom that taught life itself. She didn't speak to Flint with baby talk, nor did she offer exaggerated affection. Instead, Ileana observed, patiently, silently, like someone trying to read a language written in posture, in eye movement, in the subtle flick of an ear, or the rhythm of the breath. She always carried a fabric-bound notebook, labeled in small handwriting, "Student Project, Animals and Post-Traumatic Recovery Behavior." This wasn't a typical homework assignment. It was her self-chosen final term project, after she'd turned down easier topics like family pets or friendship between kids and animals. At first, Morin was surprised to see how seriously Ileana recorded every detail of Flint's behavior, tracking time, sketching the kennel layout, and the shifting position of objects each day. But the more she watched, the more Morin realized. Ileana wasn't just gathering data. She was looking for a way to heal herself, through understanding a creature whose hurt had reached its core. Flint seemed to sense something in her, too. He didn't react strongly like he did to most adults. He wasn't cautious around her. He didn't wag his tail when she approached, but he often edged a little closer to the bars, as if trying to better hear the scratch of her pen, or see more clearly the expression in her eyes, which held no pity, no curiosity, only a quiet desire to understand. One afternoon, as a light rain fell outside, Ileana sat beside Kennel 14, flipped open her notebook, and wrote, "Day 9. Flint does not bark, does not demand, but always moves the stuffed bear to the front of the kennel at the same time every day. Possibly a conditioned response, but could also suggest a time-linked memory signal. Observation: he responds better to lower-pitched sounds, neutral male voices, than high ones, female shouting. Early conclusion: he does not just remember, he can distinguish." A moment later, she added a different kind of line. Not a scientific note, but a whispered diary thought. Maybe Flint once knew love, and because he knew love, he also knows pain. Ileana began experimenting with small interactions. She didn't reach inside. She didn't force contact. She simply nudged the stuffed bear back toward the center of the kennel when Flint accidentally pushed it askew. The first time, Flint flinched, but then he stepped forward, not to reclaim it, but to lay his chin on the toy again. His gaze still turned outward, but now, part of it lingered with the girl who had noticed. Morin, reading through the pages Ileana had once forgotten on her desk, was struck by one particular note. When Flint sees a new staff member enter with impatience, he doesn't growl. He retreats. No reaction doesn't mean no feeling. This is his way. Silence to observe, stepping back not out of fear, but to avoid hurting anyone else. This isn't survival instinct. It's a sign of emotional awareness. Garrett, hearing Morin read that aloud, was quiet for a long time before murmuring, "This girl, she sees Flint like she sees herself in the mirror." On another afternoon, during a rare clear sky between storms, Ileana entered the visitation room with an old camera slung around her neck. She sat on the floor, a few steps away from Flint, not snapping any photos. After nearly 10 minutes, when he had settled into his usual calm posture, she raised the camera slowly and took a single shot. The image didn't show his face, only Flint's back pressed against the old chair where Mr. Ellis had once sat. She placed the photo in her notebook and wrote a single sentence beneath it. "Sometimes someone doesn't look at you, but still chooses to stay. And that is enough." That evening, when Morin came to check Kennel 14 as usual, she noticed something had shifted. Flint still brought the stuffed bear to the front. He still rested his chin on his paws. But his gaze was no longer fixed on the hallway beyond. This time, his eyes looked sideways, toward the small desk in the corner of the office, where a green cloth notebook lay open, a handwritten page glowing beneath the lamplight. In the early days of December, the air turned colder faster than expected. Rain began falling regularly, soft and steady like the quiet breathing of the earth, releasing something long held in. Ileana kept coming to the shelter, still sitting beside Kennel 14 each afternoon, still documenting Flint with the measured pen of someone who understood that healing could never be rushed. Flint, too, had begun to change. He started eating regularly. He allowed a few familiar staff members to come near. Sometimes, on the quietest afternoons, he even yawned and rested his head gently on Morin's arm, a small signal that trust was beginning to grow again. But despite the daily signs of improvement, one thing remained unchanged. Every day, at the same time, Flint still brought the stuffed bear to the front of his kennel. He no longer stared down the hallway as he once had, but he never skipped the ritual. Then, one evening, when the wind howled louder than usual and the rain lashed against the windows like someone knocking on the panes of memory, Mr. Ellis returned. No one knew what he'd been thinking during his absence. Maybe he needed time to be sure, or maybe he had feared himself, afraid that in stepping toward a creature so deeply wounded, he would have to face the fracture inside himself that he had long hidden behind silence. But that night, in the middle of a storm, he arrived. No umbrella, no call ahead, just a man walking through the rain like someone who had wandered too far from himself and had finally come back to find the way. Moraine spotted him from the end of the hallway, soaked, slightly hunched from the cold. But his eyes were strangely bright, not with certainty, but with the kind of resolve that accepts that not everything right is easy, and not every encounter can be postponed forever. At Kennel 14, Flint was already standing. No summons needed. He simply stood there, silent. His tail didn't wag. His eyes were wide open. His body held a quiet tension like he was steadying his heartbeat for two. And when Mr. Ellis reached the gate, Flint stepped forward, one sure step after another. No hesitation, no fear. He didn't wait for a word. He simply raised one paw and rested it on the man's rain-soaked boot, as if to say, "I knew you'd return. I was waiting." Mr. Ellis knelt, his first time lowering himself before Flint not to inspect, but to admit, "I don't have the strength to keep walking alone." Rain clattered on the tin roof above, each drop cracking like memories being knocked loose. But in the middle of all that noise, the man whispered, so softly it could have been a breath, "You don't need me, but I need someone to step toward me." Morin, watching from the hallway, gripped the doorframe, steadying both her body and the flood of emotion rising inside. She had witnessed many reunions, rushed hugs, bright-eyed hope, But this moment between an older man and a not-so-young dog, both bowing their heads toward each other, was the quietest, deepest encounter she had ever seen. There was no barking, no tail thumping, just rain, and the heartbeat sync of a human soul and a canine soul, both shaped by loss, now finding something unnamed, but enough to make them stay. That night, the adoption papers remained unsigned. Mr. Ellis simply said to Morin, "Give me a few days, I'll be back, next time, to bring Flint home." And Flint, returning to his kennel, didn't bring the stuffed bear to the door. He placed it in the center, facing inward, and lay beside it. Because now, the thing he had been waiting for was a little closer than before. After the rain and the emotionally heavy, quiet afternoon at the Fullbrook shelter, Mr. Ellis didn't return immediately. He needed time, not to think things through, but to reorder the fragments of memory long dormant in the deafening stillness of his home. He cleaned out the old dog bed of the one she had once kept, brushed the dust off the rug where she used to sit and knit, and cracked open the window to the long-neglected garden. It was as if he were preparing to welcome back something life had once taken, now returning in a different form. And then, on a rainless morning, he came back to the shelter. No long explanations, no questions. He simply handed over an old leather collar, a carefully oiled leash, and a thick, reddish-brown wool blanket, Helen's favorite color. Flint, upon seeing him through the bars, didn't react wildly. No howling, no barking, no jumping. He simply stood and walked forward slowly, his eyes wide and calm, as if recognizing something inevitable. Perhaps for souls that have once been broken, the feeling of coming home doesn't come through action, but through the recognition of an old gaze that hasn't left them behind. The old pickup rolled quietly along the empty road, tires crunching over dry leaves. Mr. Ellis didn't turn on the radio like he used to. In the truck cabin, the only sound was Flint's steady breathing, the most alive sound in his house for the past 2 years. When the vehicle stopped, Flint didn't leap out. He looked around. Not anxious, but not excited either. His first step onto the damp earth was deliberate, slow, steady, and cautious. Like a soldier returned from a long march, not seeking welcome, only wanting to step inside without being turned away. The small wooden house stood still among the pines, draped in the color of time. No voices, no music, nothing but clean air, the hush of wind, and a door left open as if it had always been that way. Only now, the one who used to open it was no longer standing there. Flint paused at the threshold. Then, without a cue, he walked slowly around the room, in circles, as if reading an old book through smell, through air, through the tiniest vibrations between body and space. When he stopped at the window, Mr. Ellis thought he'd lie down. But Flint turned, headed straight for the corner of the room where the faded floral armchair sat untouched since Helen passed. No one had moved it. He stopped at the base of the chair, staring for a long time, a gaze that froze the old man in place. Then Flint stepped closer, sat, placed one paw beside the chair, and raised his head to look at the wooden photo frame on the side table. That photo, Helen smiling softly, her eyes gazing toward something the photographer could no longer remember, had always been the one thing Mr. Ellis couldn't put away, yet also couldn't bear to face for too long. But now, another pair of eyes was looking at it, and that gaze, not sorrowful, not intense, but quiet, understanding, felt like a greeting that needed no words. Ellis stepped forward, standing behind Flint, his hands hanging loosely. It had been so long since he felt something truly alive in his presence. No noise, no demand, no competition, just presence. And in that silent presence, Flint brought breath back into a house that had long been occupied only by memory. He didn't lie down right away. He circled the chair once, then returned to the same spot. Lying close, his body resting on the rug as if it had always belonged there. This time, he didn't rest his head on a stuffed toy, but curled up, head tucked onto his front legs, eyes half closed. A posture so familiar. A posture reserved only for places that feel safe. Ellis sat beside him, not reaching out, only placing his hand near. The light slanted through the window, casting a warm streak across the graying crown of his head and Flint's back. And in that moment, he said softly, his voice emerging from somewhere deep in his chest, that he hadn't known still had words. This house has been silent long enough. Every step you take feels like it's waking up the old heartbeat in these wooden walls. Flint opened one eye, not lifting his head, not barking, only inching closer to the man's hand. A small gesture, but one that made Mr. Ellis feel, for the first time in 2 years, that he was no longer sitting alone. That night, he didn't close his bedroom door as he used to. He laid out Helen's wool blanket beside the bed, not as a command, not as an invitation, then turned off the light and lay down. In the dark, a soft rain returned, tapping rhythmically on the roof like a memory box being gently opened. Flint lay below, still and breathing evenly. Before drifting off, Mr. Ellis spoke. Not sure if Flint could understand, but believing some things don't need meaning to be felt by the heart. Tomorrow, we'll tend the garden again. I think you'd want to help her keep everything green. The first days of Flint living with Mr. Ellis passed in a quiet, strangely steady rhythm. No unexpected incidents and no boisterous energy like most dogs show in a new home. And no barking. Flint didn't chew things, didn't dig, didn't demand affection or attention. Yet every step he took in that house, light as a mist, left a deep imprint. Each morning, Flint would make a round along the porch, then lie under the apple tree Helen once planted. Each afternoon, he'd lie at Mr. Ellis's feet, his head resting against the leg of the chair, eyes half closed but ears always attuned to the quiet man. No one spoke, and no commands were given, only something like an unspoken pact between two beings who had both lost something. We're here for each other. No reasons needed. Mr. Ellis still clung to his old habits. Not out of denial, but because he didn't know how else to live. He still went into the kitchen every morning to make tea, not for anyone else, but as a way of saying Helen's name in silence. She had loved honey chamomile, a kind he never drank but always prepared, and since the day she passed, he kept doing it, as if making tea for a soul that still lingered quietly in the house, not fully gone. The tea jar, old glass with a scratched metal lid, was the one thing that remained untouched from Helen's time. Each time he opened it, it took effort. But that morning, the weather had turned colder, and his hands were stiff from not wearing gloves. For the first time in many months, the lid wouldn't budge. He tried. Once, twice, 3 times. Nothing. On the 4th try, he gave up, placing the jar on the table. His hands trembled, his breath shortened. It was just a tea jar, but behind it lay a trail of habit, memory, and the creeping fear that if he couldn't even keep this small ritual going, then what else was worth holding on to? He sat down, still holding the jar, eyes red, his face lowered, shoulders shaking slightly. He didn't sob like an old, broken man. His pain made no sound, only a silent fracture, seeping into the air, soaking into the worn-out kitchen. Flint had been lying near the fireplace. He didn't immediately rise, but as if some invisible thread connected his soul to the man crumpling nearby, he stirred. No rush, no confusion. He rose, each step steady and slow, and came closer. Mr. Ellis didn't notice. He was busy keeping himself from breaking open, trying to hold on to something he'd buried for months. Since the day no one made him tea, no one asked, "Are you tired today?" when he sat down. It wasn't until a warm pressure touched his hand that he flinched. Flint didn't bark, didn't whimper, didn't paw at him like dogs often do when seeking attention. He simply pressed his head into the man's hand, the very hand still gripping the tea jar. A gesture is both gentle and certain, not to play, not to comfort by instinct, but as if to say, "I know, and I'm here." Mr. Ellis looked down, met those deep brown eyes, not questioning, not probing, just watching him like they were listening to a very sad piece of music being played from the human heart. And he cried. Not in sobs, not in panic, just the slow, silent tears of an old man who hadn't dared admit weakness for too long, because he knew the woman he'd loved most was gone. But now a creature that didn't need to understand his grief had chosen to stay beside him anyway. "You don't speak," he whispered, placing a trembling hand on Flint's head. "But I understand now. You know how to answer." From that day on, Mr. Ellis stopped referring to Flint as just a rescue dog. He began saying simply, "He's the one who stays with me. No reasons, no demands, but at the right time." When Ileana came to visit, she wrote a short entry in her journal. Day 17. Flint still hasn't barked, but Mr. Ellis said, "He knows how to answer. Maybe love doesn't always speak in sound. Maybe healing doesn't come from action, but from presence." That night, it rained again. Mr. Ellis left the door open, not because he feared being alone, but because he no longer needed to close it. Flint lay by the doorway, eyes facing out like he was on guard. Then, gently, he turned, stepped into the room, and lay beside the bed, a soft punctuation mark to a wordless day. For the first time in many years, Mr. Ellis slept without dreams, and when he woke, the first thing he saw wasn't the shadow of memory, but a pair of brown eyes looking at him as if to say, "Today, we keep living together." Since that morning, when Flint gently laid his head on Mr. Ellis's hand, like an unspoken reply between two souls once shattered, the little house had begun to breathe again with the warmth of life. There was no need for barking, no need for excited displays of affection. Just Flint's quiet presence and his attentive gaze were enough for Mr. Ellis to feel a slow revival in his heart. New shoots of feeling sprouting where he once thought time and loss had turned everything barren. Flint walked beside him every day, like a loyal shadow, never ahead, never behind. Sometimes, as he stood at the window watching the rain fall, Mr. Ellis found himself wondering, had Helen, his late wife, somehow sent this creature to accompany him in his final years, to quietly reach that sleeping corner of his heart? And so, that afternoon, when Mr. Ellis took Flint to the park, the one he and Helen had often visited, sitting beneath the quiet maples, now shedding golden leaves like a carpet of memories, he had no way of knowing how quickly something reborn could again slip from his grasp. Flint walked as usual, slowly, evenly, pausing occasionally to sniff a leaf or follow a bird with his eyes. He didn't wag wildly or look on edge. His gait was a rare balance of calm and alertness, as though fully aware of the world around him, but unwilling to be disturbed by it, until the ambulance siren. The shrill sound sliced through the still afternoon like a blade, shattering the peace with a cold, sharp edge, and in that instant, Flint froze. He stood as if petrified, eyes wide, ears perked, back taut like a drawn bowstring stretched to its breaking point. And then, as if yanked by an invisible thread from some buried memory, Flint bolted. No howl, no glance back, just that familiar body, peaceful just seconds before, now streaking like an arrow, cutting across the trail, weaving through the trees, chasing a sound already fading in the distance. "Flint! Flint, stop!" Mr. Ellis cried, his voice cracking through the air. But no reply came, only the beginning of rain. The downpour hit without warning, fierce and lashing as if the sky itself had been torn open by the same memory that had struck Flint. Mr. Ellis gave chase, slipping on the waterlogged ground, each step a dagger to his breath. The wind lashed his face, his coat soaked through, glasses fogged and useless. But still he stumbled forward. Still he shouted Flint's name like calling back a torn piece of his soul. Where had he gone? Ahead, only murky emptiness. Tracks on the grass vanished under the rain within minutes. People hurried past with umbrellas, none noticing the old man staggering through the storm, none seeing that a parting was unfolding, not with words, but with distance too wide to measure. Flint, the dog who never barked but knew how to answer, had left, as if summoned by some command from within, from a place he had never fully escaped. Mr. Ellis collapsed by the path, rain soaking his silver hair, streaming through the wrinkles on his brow, dripping onto empty hands. The cold reached deep into his joints, making him tremble. But the tremble wasn't from his body. It was from the terror that he had once again lost the only thing that could still touch his heart. No one knew what that siren had triggered in Flint. Perhaps it was the echo of his days as a discarded soldier in the training center. Perhaps it was a memory of someone he hadn't saved, a steel door closing, the eyes of a sibling left behind. What was certain? Flint hadn't run away from Mr. Ellis. He had run toward something unnamed, something that still startled him in his voiceless dreams. When the rain stopped, the park returned to its muted quiet, as if nothing had ever been disturbed. But the bench beneath the maples was cold and wet. Mr. Ellis's trembling legs had ceased moving, and Flint, the dog who taught him to believe in gentleness, was no longer there. Only the old man remained, standing still in the vastness, eyes scanning a nothingness still filled with hope, like someone who once lost the whole world, now asking only for the return of a creature who did not speak, but knew how to listen. Morning had not yet broken. The air hung heavy and violet like an old blanket still holding the warmth of the night. The rain had stopped sometime after midnight, but stray droplets still fell from the eaves. Soft taps in the silence, like the slow breath of a world just waking from a long sleep. Inside the small house, nestled on a low hill, Mr. Ellis sat alone in the kitchen. His coat hung loosely over his shoulders, still damp and cool. He had not slept all night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Flint running through the rain. That headlong sprint, no glance back, drawn by something deep in his past that Mr. Ellis couldn't reach. Part of him wanted to understand. The other part feared that understanding might mean he had no right to keep Flint at all. He had called out all afternoon, searched the park, and walked the surrounding blocks with the panic of a father chasing a missing child. Rain lashed his eyes. The wind screamed in his ears. His limbs turned to lead. But still, he walked, as if just one more step would reveal Flint standing somewhere, glancing back with apology. But no one was there. By nightfall, he returned home, empty-handed, heart heavy. For the first time in years, he felt truly old. And then, as he sat under the weak yellow glow of the kitchen light, its warmth no match for the darkness in his mind, he heard a sound, a scratch at the door. Software, unhurried, as if whoever was knocking knew the owner had been listening for it from dusk until dawn. He shot to his feet. His heart dropped into his chest, then soared up all at once. His hand reached for the knob, touched the cold metal, and turned it gently, afraid that too much force might make the vision disappear. But it wasn't a vision. Flint stood there, soaked, silent, but as real as the rain that had fallen all night. In his mouth was something small, held carefully, an old cloth, muddy, rain-soaked, crumpled but intact. Every folded edge is preserved. Flint didn't whine, didn't bark, didn't leap like other dogs reunited with their people. He simply stood there, steady and certain, his dark eyes fixed on Mr. Ellis as if trying to speak words no one had ever taught him. Mr. Ellis bent down, touched the cloth, and his heart clenched. He recognized it. He'd seen it once, on an afternoon not long ago. It was the scarf that Mrs. Dela, the silver-haired woman who adopted Little Cove, had wrapped around the puppy's neck that first day she took him home. He remembered clearly, a widow, holding the scarf like it was the last warm thing left in her life. And now that same cloth sat in his hand, wet, soiled, but still holding some quiet warmth. He looked up. Flint still watched him. The panic from the day before was gone from his eyes. Now there was something else, awareness, purpose, and a message that needed no words. We have to go. No further exchange was needed. He opened the door. Flint stepped inside, just as quietly as he had stepped out of Ellis's life the day before. He didn't shake off the water, didn't leave a mess, yet his return lit the house brighter than any lamp. In the firmness of his step, the way he lay down on the familiar rug, still holding the cloth until Ellis took it, there was a strange sense of control, as if he hadn't returned because he was lost, but because he had found the next road they needed to take. Mr. Ellis sat beside him. His hands trembled, partly from the cold, partly from a storm of emotion too full to name. He looked again at the cloth, then at Flint, who still watched him, as if confirming that this moment was not coincidence. Flint hadn't run from fear. He had left because something old and unsettled had called him, and it had led him to this scarf, a thread of memory, of connection not yet complete. Mr. Ellis exhaled, but not with the fatigue of last night. This was the release of the decision. He looked out the window, where the first light of day touched the curtain's edge. The rain had stopped. The earth was still wet, but the air had changed. A new day had arrived, and he knew he would not stay behind. On the table, the scarf was folded neatly. On the floor, Flint lay still, eyes half shut, ears turned toward him, waiting for a signal, for a final agreement. No one said anything. No one needed to. Mr. Ellis stood, grabbed his coat, picked up the keys, and gently touched Flint's head. Exactly the way Flint had once placed his head in his hand that first morning, they truly understood each other. And then, without command, Flint rose, straight-backed, poised, ready. The door opened. A cold wind swept in, carrying the smell of rain-soaked earth and the strange breath of a journey waiting ahead. Two souls, once thought left behind by life, now stepped out together, following the trail of a scarf, following the call of instinct, memory, and a love that had never truly ended. They hadn't even left yet. Before the wheels could turn, the phone forgotten on the dining table buzzed unexpectedly. Mr. Ellis, coat just on his shoulders, the old cloth Flint had brought back from the realm of memory folded carefully and tucked near his heart, was ready. Flint stood by the door, alert like a soldier awaiting his signal, eyes fixed unwaveringly on him. The call came from Morin, a longtime staff member at Fullbrook Animal Shelter, the only link that had once connected Flint and Cove when they were separated. His voice, though trying to remain calm, carried an urgency only those who've worked too long with abandoned animals could recognize. When a soul begins to shut down, there are no cries, no howls, only a quiet fading, like a flame deprived of air. Ellis, I know it's early, but you need to hear this before you go. Cove has returned to the shelter. There was a pause between the two old men. Outside, the wind rustled through rain-dampened trees. The scent of wet earth still lingered in the air, nudging memories closer. Mrs. Della can't manage anymore, Morin continued, his voice dropping low. She was admitted to a care facility yesterday. No one in her family can take care of Cove. They brought him back. And the boy, he's not doing well, Ellis. He's not eating, not responding, not howling, not barking, just curled up in the corner of his old kennel like he's waiting for something that'll never return. Mr. Ellis didn't answer right away. Inside him, there was a feeling that was both joy and pain, like fate was trying to complete something left unfinished, and like an old wound reopening, not to hurt again, but to finally heal the right way. He looked at Flint, the dog still standing like stone, ears perked, eyes seemingly tuned to every word passing through the invisible current. Something in the air had shifted. Both he and Flint could feel it. "We'll come now," Mr. Ellis said. No hesitation. No questions. The words fell out like a promise long overdue. When the truck pulled up to Fullbrook Shelter, the sun had risen. bright but gentle, as if offering a soft welcome to two tired souls trying to return to their rightful place in the world. Flint didn't wait for the door to open. He leaped out, muddy paws hitting the ground, and walked directly to the row of kennels, where he and his brother had once slept side by side in the earliest days of rescue. Morin was already waiting, hands buried deep in his coat pockets, hesitation etched on his face. But when he saw Flint, he gave a quiet nod and pointed to the end of the row. Cove was there, curled up like a pile of cooling ash, his back to the world, unresponsive even as footsteps approached. The once bouncy little body was now thin, his fur rough and patchy, ears drooping as though every sound had been locked away inside a sealed box since the day he was taken. Flint didn't bark. He just stepped closer, nose nearly touching the bars. A long breath escaped him. Not hurried, not forced, just a quiet signal, a coded message only those who had once shared warmth in the rain could understand. Then Cove turned his head. The eyes that once gleamed were dim now, like a pool after the storm. But upon seeing Flint, they flickered. A faint glimmer sparked, like a forgotten candle being lit again after endless dark. Cove didn't cry out, didn't bark. He simply walked, slow, trembling steps, until his nose pressed against the bars where Flint waited. And in that moment, the two dogs, children lost to the world, let out a low, shared whine. It carried no words, no clear meaning, only the pure emotion of two souls finding each other across the fence of separation. Morin turned away. He'd seen countless reunions, but rarely had he had to look away to hide the sting of tears. He knew animals that had loved each other since youth didn't forget easily. But few ever witnessed a bond so deep it became a part of their instinct to live, like Flint and Cove. They stood together for a long time. No scratching, no begging, just watching, occasionally touching noses, occasionally bowing heads as if apologizing for a world that tore them apart. Standing beside Morin, Mr. Ellis exhaled, a long, steady breath, like setting down a heavy stone after carrying it for too long. To him, the two dogs haven't strayed anymore. They were living memories, finding their way back to each other to mend what humans had once unknowingly torn. "We won't separate them again," he said. No one needed to agree. It was decided. And Flint, hearing those words, finally closed his eyes, as if that was the line he'd been waiting for all along, and now, at last, he could breathe in peace. The morning after their seemingly impossible reunion, Fullbrook Shelter felt unnatural still, as if the very air had stepped aside to let long-suppressed emotions breathe free. Cove had fallen asleep that night, not in a house, not on a soft bed, but curled up in the corner of the old kennel, right next to the bars where Flint had rested, watching over every rise and fall of his breath like a gentle sentry, guarding the most fragile thing he'd ever known. Mr. Ellis stayed beside Morin for a long time, saying nothing. They didn't discuss the next steps, or what the future might hold. They simply remained there, witnesses to something sacred somehow made part of it. The next morning, at Morin's suggestion, Cove was taken for a general health check at a veterinary clinic not far from the shelter, just to ensure that, though thin and weak, he wasn't facing anything serious. The shelter's van, an old, creaking vehicle that had carried countless lost lives through silent curves, set out early. Flint wasn't allowed to go. That was the rule. But from the moment the door closed, Flint's eyes stayed fixed in the direction the van had gone. His ears remained sharp, body tense like a drawn string waiting to hum. Mr. Ellis saw it, too. How Flint circled once, returned to the gate, stared after the van, moved again, as if asking, "Why are we being separated again?" But this time, there was nothing he could do but gently stroke his head and whisper, "Just a checkup, kiddo. He'll be back soon." But Flint didn't hear that. Or rather, he heard something else. An hour later, just as Mr. Ellis was about to make tea, the phone rang. And this time, Morin's voice was no longer steady. The van was in a minor accident. Near the South Bridge. No serious injuries. But Cove jumped out during the chaos. We haven't found him yet. I've sent people along the riverbank. Before the call even ended, a crashing sound echoed through the hall. Flint, jerked as if the message had exploded inside him, had already torn free from the loosely tied lead in the corridor. A yank so sharp, so instinctive, Mr. Ellis couldn't react in time. Flint didn't bark, didn't howl. He just bolted, body pulled not by command or memory, but by something older than either. Something called kinship. "Flint! Wait! Stop!" Ellis shouted after him, but Flint never looked back. All he could do was chase. The path outside the shelter was slick from the rain. Tire tracks still marked the wet earth. Flint raced ahead, pausing now and then to sniff deeply, then changing direction, as if not following scent, but sensing something more elusive guiding him forward. Mr. Ellis followed, heart pounding, unsure whether he was more afraid for Flint, or for whatever they might find. When they reached the old bridge, where the van had been during the chaos, Moran and 2 other staff members were already wading along the banks, calling Cove's name, eyes darting desperately like searching for a fallen bird. But it was Flint who found him. He stopped suddenly near a patch of disturbed brush, where the leaves and dirt looked recently pushed aside. He let out a low whimper. Not a bark, not a cry, just a whisper, "You're here, aren't you?" Then he dove in. Swift, fearless. Mr. Ellis moved to follow, just as a faint whine drifted up from the slope. Cove, tucked beneath the bridge's edge, his back scraped, one front leg swollen, but breathing. Flint didn't leave. He wrapped around him, trying to warm him with his not-quite-dry coat. No whines, no pawing, just lying there, eyes fixed on his brother, his breath calm and steady, as if to say, "It's okay, I'm here now, I made it." When Mr. Ellis and Moran climbed down, Flint didn't move aside or retreat. He just shifted slightly, still watching, to make sure no one would take his brother without him knowing. Cove looked up, weak, his eyes holding barely a flicker. But in that flicker was Flint's reflection, and like a spark relit in the night, Cove let out a tiny whimper, for the first time since he was taken. A thin, fragile sound, but one that caught in every throat. Flint exhaled. For the first time, he closed his eyes, as if only that sound had finally proven to him that he was alive. The 3 men leaned down, hands trembling more from emotion than exhaustion, and as sunlight filtered through the trees, lighting up the thin bodies of 2 dogs touching only by breath, Mr. Ellis spoke, his voice low but resolute. "From now on, no one gets left behind again." Cove was brought back to the shelter, wrapped in a soft ash-gray blanket, curled tightly inside it after a night spent in cold rain and nameless panic. Flint walked beside him, no leash, no commands, keeping just enough distance to always stay in his brother's line of sight. Like a silent, steady bodyguard, he didn't scratch at the door, didn't push forward, didn't show impatience. But in every step, every turn of the head, you could feel his restraint, holding himself back from rushing in to hold his brother, to not startle him again. That afternoon, the air at Fullbrook Shelter was so thick with quiet that you could hear the breath of the hallways. Moran had prepared a small kennel in the special care area, not to confine Cove, but to give him peace, free from the sounds and stares of the other animals. Flint refused to leave, despite Moran gently suggesting he rest. Then came the moment no one had expected. Cove, once placed in the nest of blankets, didn't look at Flint. Not because he was too weak, not because he was afraid. He simply didn't recognize him. His eyes, once amber bright like rain-washed gems, were now empty, like mirrors veiled in dust. When Flint approached and lightly touched his paw to his brother's, Cove drew back into the corner. No sound, no cry, no fight, just silence. The kind that hurts more than any wail of loss. Flint froze. A breath caught in his throat. He didn't leave, but his eyes dimmed. The head that had once stood tall in the storm, that had crossed bridges and chased memory through rain, now bowed, like a blade of grass bent under a sudden wind. He lay down in front of the bars. No whines, no demands. Just lying there in the same position he had once taken every evening at the shelter, resting his chin on his paws, eyes open, watching a space that no one else could name. Ileana, the brown-haired girl who had quietly watched Flint since his first days, was also there. She felt something crack in the air, something soft but unmistakably breaking. She turned to Mr. Ellis, who had carried Flint across the city in search of something believed long lost. "Do you think he remembers?" she asked softly. "Cove doesn't, but Flint never forgot," he answered, eyes never leaving the brothers, now separated by nothing more than a row of bars thinner than time itself. Suddenly, he pulled out his phone. On it was a video Ileana had taken weeks before. One morning, while Ellis brewed tea, Flint had barked twice, short, then stopped, then let out a longer, rougher bark, a pattern, neither alarm nor joy, a sound meant for someone very specific. He pressed play. The bark echoed softly in the quiet room. Not loud, but clear. A voice calling across a long hallway of memory. Flint didn't react. It was his voice, but Cove did. His head lifted, not startled, not sudden, like someone had just handed him a key, the one that unlocked a door long shut but never fully sealed. His ears twitched. The tense body began to soften. Then, in that fragile space, Cove let out a soft whimper, a faint, thin sound. But in it, a flicker. Flint stood. He didn't rush, didn't leap. He took one step, just one, and sat down. Cove looked at him for the first time. The gaze wasn't bright, but within that heavy, sorrowful stare, something shifted. A spark of memory, a trace of warmth, a sound from long ago once echoed in the dark. And then slowly, Cove crept out from the corner, step by step, toward that bark, toward those eyes that had never forgotten who he was. When their noses touched through the bars, there was no hesitation this time. Flint whined softly. Cove answered. Two heads nudged into each other, searching for the shape they had once known, back when they lay in a cardboard box during their first storm. Ileana turned away, wordless. She didn't need more notes for her research on trauma recovery. All she needed was to stand quietly beside something being stitched back together, something no one thought could be saved. Mr. Ellis sank to the floor, leaning against the wall. His heart, hardened by years of loss, now throbbed, not from pain, but from something too real to name. It was alive and growing. And then, as if no day of separation had passed, as if those lonely months were just a stray dream, Cove quietly moved closer, leaning into Flint. Not frantic, not stumbling, not as a grand resurrection, but as a gentle shift, like an early breeze brushing the last leaf back home to its branch. Flint didn't move away. He didn't rush to meet it. He waited, and when Cove's nose touched the side of his neck, when that small head tucked into the chest that had once shielded him in that first rainy box, Flint slowly tilted his head, wrapping around his brother with all the tenderness a soul worn thin by loss could still offer. No barking, no sound is needed, just warmth, just contact, long enough to remember, soft enough not to disturb the part that had been hidden too long. Cove lay sideways, back pressed to Flint. He sighed. A breath loosed from his chest like sleep shaking off fear, the kind of breath only those who have finally come home can afford. Morin, who had seen too many lives taken in, then returned. Too many bright eyes fade into resignation, stood by the kennel door, gripping a worn towel. His eyes were wet. His shoulders, hunched inside his old sweater, trembled. Beside him, Ellis watched in silence, hands folded, thumb tracing the edge of an old leather collar. And then Flint looked up at him, not with gratitude, not with questions, but with completeness. The look of someone who had once lost everything, now being handed back the one thing no one had dared promise: family. Ellis touched his face, not to hide tears, but to hold on to something slipping from the edge of thought, an emotion that didn't ask for a name, that burned quietly because it was too gentle, too true. Morin cleared his throat. After a moment of silence, he asked, his voice low, as if afraid of disturbing the fragile air, "Are you sure, Ellis? This isn't like adopting a dog. These are two children, both broken, patched back together. Are you ready to carry that part of the world too?" Ellis turned, his hand still resting on his knee. No hesitation. His eyes were calm, but glowing like a lamp in an old house never fully darkened. "I'm not bringing home a dog, Morin. I'm bringing home its family, and maybe the missing part of mine." Ileana, watching from a few steps away, unmoving, smiled softly. She said nothing, didn't reach for her phone to record. In that moment, she understood that some things are meant to be kept only in the heart. Then Flint shifted, just enough for Cove to drape one paw over his shoulder. A sign. A single gesture he used to make as a pup, when tired, when needing safety to sleep. And this time, no one needed to shield anyone. No one had to stand guard. They had found their places again. An older brother, a younger one, and a home waiting with its door open. Mr. Ellis rose slowly. He walked out of the room, not hurried but steady, and his steps sounded different now. No longer the steps of a weary old man, but of someone who finally knew he was no longer going home alone. After all the searching, the waiting, and the breath held in quiet hope, the little house at the edge of the hill finally settled back into its rhythm. Not loud, not novel, but enough for each day to carry something gentler, something easier to breathe. The cracks inside didn't need fixing through effort or force, only the steady presence of one another, like sunlight slowly slipping through dusty panes after a long rain. Flint and Cove quickly found their rhythm again, a harmony that had never really left. Like two pieces of driftwood once torn apart, now rejoined at just the right seam. No adjustments needed. Each morning, while Mr. Ellis prepared his first pot of tea in the old kitchen, the brothers would already be at the front door, waiting for the latch to click open, for that familiar, gentle voice. "Good morning, boys." Flint always stepped out first, calm, composed, but his eyes always checked back to make sure Cove was following. And Cove, eating heartily now, sleeping more deeply, would often romp a loop around the garden, tail wagging like a child's doodle scribbled back into life, before quickly returning to lie beside his brother. On soft golden afternoons, Mr. Ellis would play the old radio on the living room table. Classical music drifted through the room like steam from his tea, thin, wistful, filled with feeling. Flint always lay beneath his feet, head resting on slippered toes, ears perked as if catching each violin note. And Cove would lie nearby, in front of the old armchair Helen once used for reading. The same spot Flint had instinctively settled into when he first came home, as though the warmth of her still lingered there. They rarely barked. Dogs who have been hurt are often quieter, but that quiet brought a special stillness, one that spoke volumes, as if in their silence they understood each other through a language that needed no sound, no teaching. Ileana continued to visit each weekend. She brought her small notebook, still documenting the changes, not for a teacher now, but as a way of keeping something beautiful alive. In one corner she'd written softly, "Some things cannot be restored, but they can be replaced, with a different kind of love, just as deep." Mr. Ellis didn't say much. A man who had lost a wife and lived in a home like a mute shell now smiled more, not loudly, not for show, but he smiled while peeling apples when he heard Cove's footsteps on the porch, or when Flint looked up at him with eyes more eloquent than any greeting. No one needed to remind him of his age. He knew, and at this age, few get to start a new family, and fewer still begin that family with 2 dogs. But he no longer felt alone, because whenever he leaned back in his chair and his thoughts drifted toward Helen, there was always a head resting quietly on his knee. A warm, living breath pulled him back to now, to this moment, where two little souls still believed. He was home, and that, truly, was everything. 1 week after peace returned, as spring began to sneak into the veins of every soft green leaf, Ileana gently suggested a small trip. Not far, not urgent, but, for her, a necessary visit. She brought it up while she and Mr. Ellis tended the garden behind the house, where Flint lay peacefully beneath the blossoming white plum tree, eyes half closed, and Cove ran about, chasing his own shadow. "What do you think about taking Flint to see Mrs. Della?" Ileana asked quietly, brushing a stray weed from the basil bed. Mr. Ellis looked up, sunlight weaving through the trees, highlighting the soft wrinkles around his eyes like threads of gold. He didn't answer immediately, but then he gave a gentle nod, his gaze thoughtful, as if he understood that some emotional circles only close when we're brave enough to return to where they began. The care home nestled quietly along a tree-lined road, the old rain trees rustling gently in the end-of-season breeze. It was the kind of place built for those who had walked most of life's path, now needing only a quiet corner to breathe and remember. Flint wasn't restless. He sat beside Ileana the whole ride, occasionally glancing out the window, as if rereading lines of memory no one else could hear. Cove, as Mr. Ellis had decided, would stay behind, for now, not out of fear, but belief, that a meaningful reunion should begin gently, at the right time. Mrs. Della sat by her window, wearing a soft pink sweater with faded embroidery, her white hair tousled, eyes still bright, just like the day she first walked through the gates of Fulbrook. But something in her gaze had grown thinner, as though time had dusted her glasses and blurred even nearby things with distance. She didn't look right away when Flint entered. Only when his soft paw steps touched the wooden floor did she turn. And then, time seemed to pause. She didn't call out, didn't speak his name. She just looked long, deeply, as if seeing something she had once believed lost, now returned in a shape too whole to believe. Her eyes wavered. Her hand trembled, reaching forward slowly. "It's Flint, isn't it?" she whispered, her voice breaking like a photograph turned too quickly. He stepped forward, neither shy nor urgent, his ears tilted gently back, a quiet greeting, and he stopped beside her knee. In that small moment, no explanation was needed. No one needed to say how many months had passed or name the thorns between them. Only one thing mattered. Flint had kept his promise. Her hand rested on his head, trembling, soft but not frail, then slid along his thick fur, stopping behind his ear, the very spot she used to rub when saying goodnight to Cove. Her eyes blurred again, but this time the tears weren't from sorrow. They were from something finally complete, not the past returning, but the present stitching shut an old tear. "Thank you for keeping your word," she murmured, as if speaking to memory itself, to something her heart had held all along, even when reason had told her to let go. Flint didn't bark. He just pressed his head into her lap. Softly, slowly, an embrace without arms, without words. A gesture so quiet, it hurt. Ileana stepped back, gripping her bag strap tightly. She had never seen light so gentle in this room. Light not from lamps, not from windows, but from the way two souls can meet in real life through memories no one else can claim. A while later, Mr. Ellis brought Cove inside. At first, Cove was hesitant. Slow steps, head lowered, as if unsure whether he still belonged to something once so kind. But with one soft beckon from Mrs. Della, one tender call, "Cove, dear," he ran. Not like someone returning, but like someone who had never really been gone. 3 souls, one old, 2 young, lay together on a soft rug in a quiet room, needing nothing more. Because sometimes, the greatest fullness in life is simply to be recognized, and to know we were never truly erased from someone's heart. The afternoon light faded through the windows of the care home, where Mrs. Della sat by the window, gently stroking Flint's head as he nestled beside her feet. Cove lay curled nearby like a small ember still glowing in the hearth of a life long lived. Outside, Ileana stood silently by the glass. She didn't knock, didn't interrupt. She simply watched, as if saving this image inside her heart, the moment a promise, somehow had truly come to life. The next morning, on the drive back, in Mr. Ellis's old car where Flint always rested his head on the windowsill, Ileana remained silent. Not out of thoughtlessness, but because something had finally ripened in her heart after months of walking this journey. "Mr. Ellis," she said as they pulled up to the gate, her voice slow but steady with conviction. "I got the scholarship. The Psychology and Behavioral Science Department accepted my research on emotional recovery in animals, especially through Flint and Cove's case." Mr. Ellis looked at her in the rearview mirror. He didn't act surprised, didn't cheer. He simply nodded, lips curving slightly, like someone who had known this would happen all along. Then he asked, his voice soft and low, like the early morning hum of his old radio. "So you'll be going far?" Ileana shook her head. "No, not yet. They want me to start a pilot program, using recovered dogs in therapy for elderly patients with depression or early-stage dementia. And I'd like to start with the place where Mrs. Della lives." She paused, gently resting her hand on Flint's neck. He tilted his head slightly as if understanding every word. "I want to bring Flint and Cove into the program, not because they're special, but because they know how to be silent at the right moment, how to sit with someone at just the right time. Creatures who've known pain always seem to recognize it in others." The car fell into a thoughtful hush. Outside, sunlight spilled across the porch steps, casting a long, golden line across Flint's outstretched legs. He didn't move. He just looked at Mr. Ellis. Not a pleading look, but one of quiet readiness, like a son waiting for his father's nod to step into something greater. Mr. Ellis pulled a paper from the glove compartment, a volunteer form for the therapy program. He didn't read it again. He just picked up a pen and signed it. Then, handing it to Ileana, he spoke gently, his other hand resting on Cove's head as the pup curled against his leg. "Only one thing. No matter how tired they get after work, they still come home. Still sleep in this room. Still hear the old sonatas on the radio, and still eat dinner with me, even if it's just half a bowl." Ileana smiled. Not the smile of a student gaining approval, but the smile of someone beginning something out of both purpose and gratitude. She nodded. "I promise, this is their home, and mine too." Flint stretched and nudged his head against Mr. Ellis's hand, as if signing his part of the contract. An unwritten promise to walk with humans through their healing, but to always find the way back to the place that felt like silence, warmth, and belonging. Cove lay down at his brother's feet, eyes wide open, gazing toward the door. Perhaps, for the first time, understanding that short partings in a day no longer meant being left behind, because now they always had a place to return to. On the first day, Flint and Cove officially wore the white scarves with Shadow Path, hand-stitched in blue. The sky seemed clearer than on any other morning. Ileana adjusted Flint's leash, while Cove, ready long before, gently wagged his tail in rhythm with the wind. His eyes were bright, but not frantic like in those early months. These weren't just two dogs coming from trauma. These were two companions walking into a mission. No fanfare, no promises, just presence. Quiet, genuine presence. The care home was filled with light and curiosity. Some elderly residents sat by the windows, watching sunlight catch on bougainvillea blossoms. Others peeked shyly down the hallway, where Flint and Cove walked with steady paws and open hearts. No one said anything at first, only the slow roll of wheelchair wheels, the whisper of wind past flower pots on the balcony, and the soft tread of two dogs arriving with purpose. Flint was led into a small room where an old man with snowy hair sat by a wooden table, eyes gazing out but unfocused. He had not spoken in years, not since his wife passed. No music, no coaxing, no voice had ever reached him. Ileana sat quietly, said nothing. Let Flint do what he knew. He didn't rush. He simply placed his head gently on the man's lap. A gesture almost weightless, almost invisible, but carrying the gravity of an untouched memory. At first, the man didn't move. Then, like a wind stirring forgotten leaves, his hand slowly lowered, fingers settling on the soft fur. A breath escaped him. Soft, but undeniably real. Ileana thought she imagined it, until the man turned. His eyes, red with sudden tears, began to overflow. She used to have a dog like this. The first words in years, not triggered by therapy or song, but by a head resting on his knee, by the right presence in the right place at the right time. Flint didn't move. He just looked up with eyes calm as running water through the lines of time-worn hands. Elsewhere, in the special care unit, Cove sat beside a boy of about 8, diagnosed with autism, unaccustomed to physical contact even from his mother. At first, the boy only watched Cove from across the room, hands gripping his shirt. But Cove, gentle by instinct, not training, just sat, head tilted, ears patient. Nearly 30 minutes passed before the boy stepped forward. Slowly, one finger brushing soft fur. Cove didn't flinch. Only when the boy sat down, awkwardly, briefly, wrapping his arms around Cove's neck, did the dog let out a tiny, barely audible whimper. Not fear, not resistance, just an answer. Just yes. The boy had hugged a living being for the first time. The nurses cried. His mother stood behind the door, hands covering her mouth, shaking. No one said a word, because in moments like these, silence is the greatest respect we can offer a miracle. At sunset, Flint and Cove returned to Mr. Ellis's home. No leash, no call. They stepped across the wooden threshold like children coming home from school. On the table, the tea had gone cold, but Mr. Ellis's eyes were warm, watching Flint stretch beneath his chair, Cove curling under the table. He asked nothing, only whispered to no one in particular, as if speaking into the evening hush. No one's ever too old to be loved again. Then he turned on the old radio. A wordless piece played. Soft, gentle, just enough to make the sparrows quiet outside. Just enough to let the old pain in the house finally lift, like the last drop of dew vanishing in the setting sun. Some stories don't need grand endings or miracles, only presence, like Flint resting beside a man who lost his wife, like Cove being hugged by a child who had never hugged anyone, like the way we sometimes say nothing, yet understand everything. Flint and Cove aren't special because of what they do. They're special because of how they love, how they wait, how they always find their way back. Their story doesn't end here. It continues, every time someone reaches out to a wounded soul and stays long enough to say, "I'm not leaving." Have you ever met a dog or someone who made you believe that it's never too late to be loved again? Share your story in the comments, because maybe, just maybe, your story could heal someone who needs to hear it. If this journey touched you, please like, share with someone you love, and subscribe to our channel, so you never miss the next story of loyalty, healing, and the quiet power of belonging. We believe every heart deserves to be reached, no matter how far it's wandered.